Good evening, everybody. My name is Matt Yeager. I am a youth services assistant here at the McCracken County Public Library and have the honor of introducing Crystal Wilkinson as our speaker for Evening Upstairs. Now, Crystal and I share a little bit of history. We were both members of the very first class of students at Spalding University's Masters in Creative Writing. Now, I went into the program knowing I was a little green. I knew it. I'd only taken a handful of creative writing classes before being accepted into the master's program. I knew I was woefully underread. I knew and was a little bit wary that every piece of fiction I'd ever written was in my application to get into the program. I knew I was ignorant. And the problem with ignorance is that if you're truly ignorant, then you're ignorant of how ignorant you are, right? So I walked into the workshop thinking, at the very least, I'm in here with a lot of other students who are here for the first time who are equally as ignorant as I am, until I heard Crystal read her work. And little did I know that I was in the presence of such a beautiful and great writer. I did not know going into the program that she was already published and a well-established writer. I did not know about the authority and grace with which she could read and write. I did not know about her command of character and geography. I did not know how good she was. And being a classmate with Crystal made me feel truly, truly ignorant. Crystal is a poet and fiction writer. She has recently published her debut novel, The Birds of Opulence, and it received the 2016 Ernest J. Award for Literary Excellence. She's the author of 2 collections of short stories, Blackberries, and Water Street. She is a teacher. She's taught at both Berea. You taught at the University of Kentucky too, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And teaches at Spalding, where we graduated from. She owns a bookstore with her partner Ronald in Lexington called Wild Fig Books. If you are here tonight, Crystal has a voice for you. If you are a woman, she's your voice. If you are African American, she's your voice. If you are a Kentuckian, she's your voice. If you are a teacher, a parent, or a grandparent, she is your voice. If you're none of those things, but you're still a human being filled with passion and compassion, anger and love, history and hope, then she is your voice. Ladies and gentlemen, Crystal Wilkinson.
Thank you, Matt. And I think he did make me cry. I'm trying to hold it in. Thank you very much. I am so glad to be here this evening with you all. Thank you all for coming out on a Thursday, a balmy Thursday. And I'm just now deciding, I think I'm going to read a little bit from all 3 books. Just a little bit, just to give you a taste. So Blackberries was my first book, and was the book that I had already published before I went to get my MFA. And I think I'll just read the introduction because it'll give you a little bit a better idea of who I am. And I want to save some time at the end for questions. So this is an introduction to Blackberries. I grew up on a farm in Indian Creek, Kentucky during the 70s. I swam in creeks and roamed the knobs and hills. We had an outhouse with no inside running water. Our house was heated by coal and wood-burning stoves, and we lived so far back in the woods that we could only get one television station. But it was a place of beauty. Trees, green grass, and blue sky as far as you could see. I am country. Being a country is as much a part of me as my full lips, wide hips, dreadlocks, don't have the dreadlocks anymore, and high cheekbones. There are many black country folks who have lived and are living in small towns, up hollers, and across knobs. They are all over the South, scattered like milk thistle seeds in the wind. The stories in this book are centered in these places. As a girl, there was an extreme urgency to grow up as soon as possible. Being a woman was something that I longed for. I remember sitting quietly, watching the way my grandmother put on lipstick, circling her lips just so. I studied my mother's walk, how it changed when she was all dressed up for church. I eavesdropped in on women's business. Listened to the music my aunts and older cousins made with their voices. Observed the way my cousin's hand rested in the deep curve, separating her waist and hip, while her other hand moved in the air when she was most passionate about something. I watched how these beautiful women wore their countryness, wore their womanness, how they interacted with men, children, and each other. I wanted to learn all the ways of women folk, to capture all the secrets. What I didn't know then was that a woman's life is never cut and dried, never plain and simple, not as a girl and not as a full-fledged woman. These stories come from the ordinary and the extraordinary, from black country women with curious lives, from struggle, from fear, from love, from life, from the gut, from the heart. Black and juicy, just like a blackberry. So that's the introduction of Blackberries. It's a collection of short stories and has a range of women's voices from children to elderly, and includes a few men's voices as well. So that book originally came out in 2000, followed by Water Street, which was actually my MFA thesis when Matt and I were students at Spalding. I had already been contracted for 2 books when I was a student there, and what I did with Water Street is a short story cycle, which means all the characters in the story live on Water Street, and they all know one another. So all the stories are connected. I was talking to this gentleman here, and he was saying, he had read about Water Street, and there is a Water Street in Stanford, Kentucky. And he asked me if the book was set in Stanford, Kentucky. And it is, but it's also fiction. So what I like to say that I did is that there was a real Water Street, which was the heart of the African American community there in Stanford, in Lincoln County. And what I tried to do was capture the spirit of that community. So I moved all the real people out and moved my fictional characters into the fictional Water Street. So this is the introduction. For some reason, I enjoy, when I finish a collection, to then write an introduction that sort of gives an overarching view. So this is called Welcome to Water Street. We are almost southern, but not northern at all. Stanford's black children root here. Some of her white ones, too. This street is our homeland. In the summer, you will see our cinnamon sons, our dusty daughters wallowing in plastic swimming pools in our backyards, girls with Chinese jump ropes fashioned from a long string of rubber bands or hula hoops swirling around their hips, boys playing peggy bounce or kickball. You will smell the smoke from charcoal grills, hear the chicken and the steak sear. If you peep through the shrubs, you might catch us some sweltering afternoon with our sweet iced tea glasses turned up and our bellies full of saucy baby back ribs, collards, or kale fresh from our gardens, roasted corn on the cob, or homemade potato salad. We'll even share some, if you like. We are that kind of people. There are flowers in our mother's gardens, vegetables too, zinnias and okra, big boy tomatoes and yellow sunshine squash, begonias and black-eyed Susans, sunflowers and runner beans, potatoes and carrots, turnips and yams are rooted in our soil. Pumpkins can fall bigger than your head. Even in these times, our mahogany and oak-cast children ride bicycles along our street. They take long walks into town, to Carter's Grocery, to feast on barbecue potato chips, red pop, and fudgesicle bars. There you can buy a hogshead cheese sandwich for $1 and get chopsteak and pork chops on credit if your mother sends a note. Our children are not bad, but they are accustomed to being shooed from neighboring fields. Still, somehow, they always escape with an acceptable stash of green apples or juicy red tomatoes. Our teenagers lay on their backs at night and talk to each other and the stars right out in the street up on the hill. Katydid and crickets' symphonies sprinkle the dark of night here. We have street lights, but we are not quite country, not city at all. In the winter, grandmothers quilt the way their mothers' mothers taught them to. Pots are full of homemade chili and vegetable soup made with summer's backyard bounty. Children sled and have neighborhood snowball fights. We have hot chocolate get-togethers and coffee-sharing evenings in each other's living rooms. Our men are one generation removed from farming, but they still wear their farmers' clothes underneath work uniforms to remember where they're from. We still know the old folks' ways, even if we keep it to ourselves. When the town trucks don't make it up here to salt our street, we are content with being snowed in, knowing we still have our father's ways to keep us safe and warm and fed. Water Street is a place where mothers can turn their backs to flip a pancake or cornmeal hoe cake on the stove and know our children are safe. We are a hard-working bunch. The hawk soaring each morning in our beautiful sky sees the yellow bus that scoops up our children and takes them to school, and our cars departing to factories, to beauty shops, to offices, to the neighboring towns. We are the people who fix the street lights, ring up the groceries or the new clothes. We keep the books straight. We nurse the sick. We sew buttons. We answer the phone. We deliver the mail, deliver the truckloads. We keep the factories running. We type the papers, run the office. We teach the kids. Because there is not always work nearby, some of us migrate to Danville, to Somerset, to Lexington, even Louisville. Sometimes we are on the road for hours a day, but feel at ease when we go home. It's a choice we've made because we love our clean street, pristine yards, comfortable porches. We are safe here. We are plain and we are fancy. We love being close to the people we've known since we entered this world, and we hate it. Everybody knows your name here. Everyone has committed the long list of your kin to memory. We are God-fearing people, Baptists mostly. We attend church every Sunday. Some of us still worship where our parents' received the Lord, but some of us have moved away, and they are the ones who miss this street the most. They will always belong here, even when they think they no longer do. On Water Street, every person has at least two stories to tell. One story that the light of day shines on, the other that lives only in the pitch black of night, the kind of story carried beneath the breastbone, near the heart, for safekeeping. So that's a little introduction to Water Street. So Blackberries originally came out in 2000. Water Street came out in 2002. And then it took until 2016 for me to finish this first little novel. And since the novel has come out, Water Street and Blackberries have been republished and put back into print as well. So I think I want to read just a small excerpt from Water Street, and then let's have a talk, so y'all be ready to ask me some questions. The Birds of Opulence is about several generations of women, and particularly the women in two different families. The primary theme of the Birds of Opulence is about mental illness, and it's about the way that mental illness is handled in small towns, in Appalachian towns, and how mental illness is handled in African American families in these small towns. So just as a little, I'm going to read some from the end of chapter 2. So the year is 1976. And there has been a baby born into this family, and the baby has been born in the squash patch. The baby's mother's name is Lucy. The family is starting to feel like maybe there's something going on with Lucy that they can't quite put their finger on. It's more than postpartum. It's more than just having a baby in a squash patch. And then you have the baby's grandmother and the baby's great-grandmother. They all live in this same house. And so the great-grandmother, Mama Minnie, is very much a matriarch in the town. She's well known in her church. She's well known in the town. So even though no one else wants her to do this, she decides that since this new baby has been born, that she should open up the house and invite all the neighbors in so they can receive the new baby and have food and receive their neighbors. And so this is what happens when this occurs. So it's a few days after the baby's been born. And I'm not really an actor, but Mama Minnie kind of takes over everything a little bit, so you'll hear me code switch a little bit. When company arrives a few days later, Minnie May, in her church pearls and a touch of wine-red lipstick, posts herself in a wingback chair beside the front door. She kisses some of the women on the cheek, grasps the hands of others. She eyeballs some, but greets them politely and directs each woman toward Lucy, who is sitting almost motionless in a rocking chair across the room. "Get yourself some lemonade and go on out back," she says to the children. "In the kitchen," she says to the men and nods her head in the kitchen's direction. Outside, this night hangs like a cloak, hot and moist enough to wring out like a wet tea towel. The rain has stopped for now, and the heat causes steam to rise from the ground like smoke. A sliver of moon glows through the clouds. Lucy is at the far end of the living room, almost sullen in the rocking chair, holding the baby in a receiving blanket. Tookie, that's her mother, stands behind Lucy with her arms keeping the chair from rocking, keeping Lucy and this new baby safe and immobile. She says nothing, but nods once or twice as the women come one by one. "Pretty little thing. Law me, look at that. What a bolt from the blue," they say. "What'd you name her?" Tookie holds the back of the chair, more peaceful behind her shield. If she looks them in the eye for too long, 1943 comes humming back. She's a long-necked girl again, with her own belly 6 months swollen, cast out of the church choir, told she can't talk to her friends. Shame washes over her still. Back over Tookie's left shoulder, through the haze of insects drawn to the porch light, Kiki is playing in the yard. He has been joined by one of the Jenkins boys, and they are running around the poles of the clothesline. German chocolate cake, lemon meringue pie, pimento cheese sandwiches, sugar cookies, mints, and peanuts. Joe has moved the furniture back to make way for the crowd. Children turn noisy at the sight of dessert and are quickly shooed out into the backyard by their mothers. Girls go wide-eyed at the baby. Boys sneak extra cookies or a paper cup of lemonade and clack the back screen door behind them. Lucy rocks the baby, answers the same question a blue million times, hears men's voices ebb and flow in the kitchen. The house is alive with sound. She grins when she hears Joe's words rise and fall in the talking. "Go fishing for too long," he says. "No, not all night." "I know you right, man, I'm telling you." Cack Chevrolet. "Girl, how'd you do it? How'd you survive that field?" women her age ask. Some of them she hasn't seen since high school. "Woman always does what she has to," Lucy says. She finds a chortle somewhere inside her to make light, but even while she's throwing her head back, it sounds to her like some other woman's laugh rising up in her chest. She places a hand on her throat just to be sure. "Where's that man of yours done run off to?" one of them finally asks. He ain't run no further than the kitchen, Lucy says, and cocks her head to listen to the men. Ah, there it is. Joe's voice soothing her, even far off like that, rising up and going down low out there in the kitchen. Lucy thinks of Joe's deep laugh, his tender whisper in her ear, the deep growl of his snoring. Her hand a little shaky, Tookie steps forward and takes the baby clothes, bottles, and pink-wrapped gifts from the visitors and places them on the coffee table. She refills the lemonade and piles more sugar cookies on a serving platter before she returns to safety behind the chair. Some of the women stare. Lucy in the rocker, holding that baby and looking off into the air at nothing in particular, and Tookie with her hands gripped tightly to the back of the chair and her head dropping every time anybody tries to catch her glance. It's an odd sight. Both doors have been opened enough times that the flies are starting to settle in the house. Two of them are taking turns landing on the baby's cheeks and eyes. Others are swarming around the pie. A yellow jacket buzzes through the living room and gnats fly around the lemonade. One hums in Lucy's ear. She turns her head but doesn't even swat at it. A fly lands on the baby again, feasting on the corner of her right eye. The baby blinks. Lucy just watches the fly rubbing its front legs together, watching its tiny, hungry tongue. Tookie reaches in and shoos it from the baby's head. The fan in the corner of the living room blows hot air around. A few more men have joined the others huddled in the sweaty kitchen where they find Joe Brown on the floor under the table repairing a wobbly leg. "Congratulations, put her there," one man says, pulling Joe to his feet and shaking his hand. "She done dragged me over here. You know how the women are," another says. "How you doing, Joe? Man, you getting any sleep?" Joe Brown shakes his head, swipes his brow and his neck. "You know how the women are." The men are still talking and laughing, but Joe isn't listening fully. He wants to answer back, "No, I sure as heck don't know how the women are." But he knows the man wasn't expecting a real answer. Men pat him on his sweaty back. His silver-tongued beginnings are almost forgotten. They nod at each other with this thought in their minds. It's only when he talks fast or calls up some city-fied story that they remember where he's from. After everyone has had a bite to eat, Mama Minnie taps her cane against the floor 3 times. The room quiets and she walks into the center like a preacher woman and says, "God sure does make a way, don't he?" Sister Betty shouts, "Amen," and everyone claps. "We sure do feel blessed to have her." Mama Minnie points to the baby, "and blessed to have so many of the Lord's servants with us here today." She bows and then says, "Thank you, Jesus," and looks up at the crowd. One of the younger women whispers to the others, and they cover their mouths. People applaud again, and a few boys who have come back for more food whistle through their fingers. One of the men pulls his tall, lanky boy into the kitchen by the arm and threatens to whip him in front of everybody. A few of the women look to see if Lucy will address the group, but when she lowers her head toward the baby, the room turns noisy again. People continue milling around the house, talking among themselves, drinking every last drop of lemonade, eating every cookie, every last darn peanut. When the baby begins to cry, her tiny mouth bowing out into a perfect thimble, a few women turn and smile and tilt their heads to the side. One of them says with delight, "Ain't that the cutest thing you ever did see?" But when the baby reaches a full, soft cry, Lucy begins a howl. Tookie rubs her shoulders, but she is inconsolable. Joe comes from the kitchen, kneels down beside the chair. "Baby, are you all right?" he says. Lucy's lips are quivering, her chest heaving. She lets out a moan, cries harder, and gasps for breath. She does not stop. The crowd is now quiet again. Some of the women admire Joe's hand on Lucy's leg and feel the imaginary weight of a man's hand on their own knees. Others are whispering among themselves, "Crazy heifer, well, if that don't beat all." Lucy rocks back and forth in the chair. Tookie reaches in to take the baby. Joe strokes Lucy's knee like a man who doesn't know what else to do. But before he can intervene, before Tookie can pull the baby safely into her own arms, before Mama Minnie can cross the room, the baby rolls from Lucy's lap, rolls like a can of lard, like a wad of fabric or a cumbersome quilt. like a rolling pin or a small sack of new potatoes, and makes a light thud on the plank floor like something being cast away. There is one wide-eyed look on every face in the room. A great communal hush rises up, and for a few seconds no one says a word. Then all attention turns to Tookie, who falls to her knees, scoops the baby into her arms, and then almost topples head first when she tries to get back to her feet. A few women grab the hands of their children, lower their heads, and leave quietly. When the front door flies open and people start to step off the porch, Mama Minnie sees a large woman from church, Francine Clark, standing at the edge of the yard holding a Pyrex dish. Francine steals a nervous glance toward Mama Minnie, then nods to her and turns back toward the road without coming in, without leaving what she brought. Mama Minnie, who still has one ear on the commotion but her eye on Francine Clark, follows her wide hips down the worn path in the grass, and even in the midst of the chaos says aloud to herself, "Something always been funny about that woman." Afraid the baby might be hurt, Tookie pulls back the blanket and runs her fingers across its head in search of lumps, looks for bruises. The baby stops crying. Kiki watches his mother and watches the remaining neighbors watching his mother. "Mama!" he hollers out, but Lucy acts as if she doesn't hear him. She ignores her firstborn. She buries her eyes in her hands and bites her lips, but tears are streaming down her face and dripping off her chin. Joe rubs her arm. "Let me get you back to bed," he says, and the women are hushed again by the love in his voice. Lucy raises her head, and for a moment her face is so twisted and puffy that Joe barely recognizes her. She stands, Wiltz leans into Joe, and he leads her through the maze of onlookers to their bedroom, where he places her in the bed and pulls a sheet up over her. Nobody speaks a word until Mama Minnie says, "Here, y'all get some of this caramel cake before you leave." And Tookie, with the baby still pressed against her, rushes over to help wrap pieces of cake in tin foil with her free hand. As everyone leaves, a clap of thunder sounds in the distance, and they scatter toward their homes. Rain pours out in buckets. Elders return to their front porches. Children search for June bugs. Whippoorwills serenade a young couple who dare to make love up against the roughness of a tool shed way out there in the dark. Somewhere a dog barks for a child to come back out to play. But the baby, this Yolanda, born out in the field in the old way, and her mother, Lucy Good Brown, a plumb crazy woman, are never far from every lip. And poor Joe Brown, she's lucky as sin to have him. Wonder if he don't pack up and leave. On this night, and for a long time to come, every tongue stirs. Inside the Good house, Mama Minnie opens up her Bible, thinking of a few soothing words to say. Then just as quick, she decides to keep them to herself until morning. She reads Psalms 46. She prays before settling into bed. Girl just needs her time, she thinks. Her mind drifts back to that Clark woman out in the yard, big old body balanced on them little feet, holding her dish and not saying a word, like she didn't have a lick of sense. Tookie stares at the ceiling in her own bedroom, presses the nubby surface of her bedspread, then smooths it out with her fingers. She repeats this until she has pressed some of the worry out of her head, a tiny moment of respite before worry comes back. Something bad didn't come over her child. Kiki gets into his red pajamas by himself. He kisses his mother, his father, and his brand new sister before going to his room, wishing he could sleep with them. "Sleep tight, little man," his father says. "Good night, Kevin." His mother says nothing. Lucy and Joe spoon against one another, the baby curled against her mother's breast. By the time the house rests, Mama Minnie has already left her burden of the day and tied up her hair and is up under her sheets snoring. Everyone is asleep when Lucy cries again. Her tears come as easy as breath. She touches the child's face as it nurses, then pinches the baby's nostrils together. She does this as she feels Joe nestled against her back. How simple life is. Silly how it works, really. She could starve the child of air, and even Joe, who is snoring gently in her ear, would never know. She watches her daughter struggle for breath, watches her bright eyes widen until the legs kick and she lets go of the nipple. Lucy does it again until she can feel the baby trying to fling her head free. Then she releases and listens to her child settle into being able to breathe again. A hurried in and out, in, out. She listens for a long time, only the teeniest bit of panic rising in her until the baby's breath is in rhythm with her own again. In truth, Lucy can hear the breathing of the entire house, the out, the in, out, in. They are loud, one big choir singing out survival in the night. Her eyes race around the room, and she can smell the wildness of her own milk. Thank you. So, on that happy note of almost baby killing, does anyone have any questions or comments?
Yes, ma'am.
It's 1976. No, is that right? I think it's earlier when she's born. I think it's 1960. You can tell that I've moved on to another project. 1962. 1962, when she's born. Mm-hmm.
Who was your inspiration to start writing in the beginning?
I think I was just inspired by the books that I read. Although I come from a family of artists, but I didn't know that when I was a child. My grandmother was an avid reader, and I knew how to read before I went to school, and she always told the story that after I'd read all the books in the house, then I started writing my own. She wrote songs on the back of envelopes, and she quilted, and my grandfather whittled. My mother played piano by ear. So there was always some kind of creativity going in my house. And honestly, when I was growing up, I grew up in Casey County. I didn't have any black books. I didn't know that black people could be writers.
You grew up in Casey County.
Mm-hmm.
I grew up in Russell County.
Really? Close by. Yeah. But since then, I have lots of inspiration for writing now, other writers that have inspired me.
Who are some of your favorite writers?
We were just talking about Gail Jones. Gail Jones is a Kentucky writer and is one of my favorite writers. Toni Morrison is another favorite. Wendell Berry, Michael Ondaatje, Jhumpa Lahiri. I have a long list of favorite writers. I saw some hands up back here. Toby Press, out of London, England, that's where they were originally located, published Blackberries and Water Street initially. And then University Press of Kentucky published the Birds of Opulence.
Could you give me that? I'm working on my second book and I'm looking for a new publisher.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, University Press of Kentucky has a series called Kentucky Voices. And so if you're writing, particularly if you're writing about Kentucky, anything set in Kentucky, they have a certain time of the year that they take submissions for that. So you should get them something.
It's like open submissions that you just
Yeah,
send in a manuscript.
yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm.
I'm pleased to meet you. The Kentucky Foundation for Women,
Oh, yeah.
and we love you. I'm Paducah, and I've been wanting to meet you, and I'm an artist myself and a writer, so I hope to see you again.
Thank you. I'm glad you're here, and I love the Kentucky Foundation for Women and the Hopscotch House. I wrote some of all three of these books in the Hopscotch House.
It's beautiful. I've been there about 2 or 3 times.
Mm-hmm. You had a question back there?
Did your picture before I leave?
Yes, yes.
I was going to ask, how did you get your first break? Were you just sitting out loud?
So I've always been a shy person. It's sort of still amazing to me that I teach, because I worked in public relations for a number of years, where I was the one who sort of sat at my desk and I did news releases, or I would do PSAs or whatever, but I didn't have to go with it. You know, I could write the mayor a speech and push it on her desk and she would do it. So I always sort of stayed behind the scenes, and I had been writing my whole life And two things happened. One, I met people who were members of the Afro-Latin Poets. Like I met Frank X. Walker and Kelly Norman Ellis and Nikki Finney, and they were all sort of working together as a group, but they were all poets. And at the time, I was the only fiction writer among them. And then I was an avid reader, and I flipped over a copy of Essence magazine. And on the back of Essence magazine, or in the back, there was an ad for the Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Conference. And I decided that I had been around, and I'd gone to classes where Gurney Norman was teaching. My undergraduate degree was in journalism, but I was writing all these short stories and working in public relations. And I'd taken classes from Gurney. I took classes with James Becker Hall. And I decided, one, I wanted to be around other African Americans. I never had that. And I wondered how I would act and how things would unfold if I were around people I didn't know. So at the time, I was working for Midway College, and I just got up the gumption and I wrote a letter to the president of the college asking him, could I take the college's car, the president's car, and drive it to this conference. So that sounds really good, but what you have to know is that the president's car was like a 1987, a big Cadillac that was as long as this room. But I knew that my little jalopy wouldn't make it, so I took the president's car to that Zora Neale Hurston Richard Wright Conference, which was the very first one that they'd ever had. It was in the 90s. My children were small, so I had to this was a big deal for me. I was a single mother. My children were small. I got my mother to keep them, and then I had to have somebody else to try to help the kids. I had to take off from work. And I'm very, very shy. I was scared to death. And so I went. And while I was there, I met my first agent. And I didn't really have sense enough, or I was so scared that I didn't even know what she was saying. She said, I'd like for you to, she said, they had a little reading for the participants. And so I read part of a story, and she said, do you have other stories? And I said, yeah, I have a whole box full of them under my bed. And she said, well, will you send them to me? And at the time, I didn't even know what an agent was, really. And I said, okay, I'll send some to you sometime. And she said, can you come over here and sit down? And she was like, I'm a literary agent. This is what I do. I want to see your work. And then I got nervous all over again. But I did send her my work, and she helped put them together in a particular way, and that became Blackberries. And she sold that first book for me. That's how I got started. Because I always thought that my idea of success as a writer was that if I ever got a story published in a magazine that I had heard of. And I'd done that. I was fine. Like I got published in, I think it was called Southern Exposure. And maybe other people hadn't heard of it, but I'd heard of it. And I was like, yes. I'd never thought about a book until she came along. Mm-hmm.
So were the stories that you sent her, had any of them been published in any magazines, or they were all?
One of them had been published in Southern Exposure, and I can't even remember which one. I think it tells you in the credits in here. But that one had been published.
Was the response so great that you were then contracted for 2 other books based on the sales of that?
I was contracted for 2 other books based on Blackberries, yeah. Yeah. And that sounds much more romantic than it ended up being, because it took me so long to get the Birds of Opulence finished that Blackberries was published on its own, and then I had a 2-book deal that was supposed to be Water Street and Birds of Opulence, and I delivered Water Street, but like I said, Birds of Opulence didn't get published till 2016. So I sort of forfeited part of that that advance, because by the time Birds was published, Toby Press had already decided that they only wanted to publish Jewish titles, and they had sold the rights to these 2 books all from that press.
I was going to ask about the 16 years.
The 16 years, a lot of it involved fear. Even though I had success, some success with the first 2 books, a lot of it involved fear, and a lot of it was me fighting with the material. I thought that if I was going to write a novel, it needed to be a traditional novel in the way that people are accustomed to reading a novel, with a clear beginning, middle, and end. And because I'm so fond for the short story in that form, and I'm very fond of anything that's nonlinear, I love books that start at the end and move toward the beginning or do weird things. And I kept falling into that. And I was like, no, it's my first book. It's got to be, one, it had to be big, and it had to be traditional. And this book, because it is about mental illness, because it is about memory, did not want to do that. And so I spent a lot of those years fighting with the form. And finally, a friend of mine, the writer A.J. Verdell, who wrote The Good Negress, said, she said, Crystal, well, you know, and she didn't realize that this had such a big impact on me. But at that time, I was like reaching for anything. And she said, structure is the last frontier in writing a novel. And I said, oh, structure is the last frontier. And so once I gave in and stopped caring about what people would think, and stopped caring about, there was a lot of interest in this book by mainstream publishers, and I sort of was too stubborn to give in, because once I came upon the form that I thought the book felt comfortable to be in, felt comfortable to me, it felt right, even though it wasn't traditional. Several larger publishers liked it, but they wanted me to completely change it. And it took a lot of soul searching, because it was like I could change it and get published by a bigger press that everybody's heard of, or not change it and feel like I was being truthful to the story. And I decided not to change it, and that's how I ended up with University Press, because I had a lot of things that people would say things like, this doesn't sound like a novel, this feels like a collection of stories, or stories that are linked. And I was like, yes, that's what yeah. And they were like, no, that's not what we want. We want, a plot-driven novel, like a really traditional. And I tried to turn it into that. And so some of those years was spent beefing it up. And at one time it was more traditional. It was up around 300 pages, and it had more of a clear plot line that you could track. And it just didn't feel organic. So I decided I could either go bigger, or I could distill it down. And the final edits that I did, I took a lot out. I decided I wasn't going to put more in, I was going to take out. And so I kept boiling it down and boiling it down, and ended up editing it the same way that I would a poem. And so that's how it got into the form that it's in. And so it was very rewarding when, even though publishers and editors didn't seem to understand it, it was very rewarding that it did win a national prize and 2 regional prizes. I never expected it to do anything, especially with a University Press. So I was over the moon about that. I was like, somebody gets it. So. Mm-hmm.
And then the way you told it was argumentative discourse. It was told through you and then through other eyes. And that was beautiful. And very folklore. I like that.
Thank you. Yes.
What about your poetry?
I love poetry so much that every time somebody says that, I kind of go, because I always, it's not that I think that I'm a good fiction writer either, but I do it. But I love poetry so much, and the poems that I simply adore, I know my work doesn't even come close. So I have, that long for this book. I have a couple of collections of poetry that I've been working on for more than 20 years. One of them is the Water Witch poems, a set of persona poems about my grandfather who was a water witch. I'm working on that for 20 years now, and still don't have those together. I'm also working on a collection of poems that are in my grandmother's voice. My mother, one of the reasons why I'm interested in mental illness is because my mother was a paranoid schizophrenic and was in and out of mental institutions for 10 years. So between 1960 and 1970, she was institutionalized 8 years off and on during those 10 years. And so I'm writing sort of a set of epistolary poems that are like letters from my grandmother, in my grandmother's voice, about my mother. So I've been working on those for a long time too. And occasionally I'll be brave enough to send a poem out and it'll get published. But I don't have a collection of poetry yet. It scares me. Like I told an audience not too long ago, they were like, "Do you write poetry?" I said, "Well, I have these things that are smaller, run down the page in a certain way. Sometimes they're broken up by smaller lines." And somebody said, "Poems." And I said, "If that's what you want to call them, I'm working on them." I do not have time to write every day. When I'm feeling really good about my writing and feeling really on fire, like when the blue flame is going, and I feel like I'm at the center of something, I get up at 3 a.m. and I write from 3 to 5, 3 to 4, 3 to 6, however much time I can get in there. But that's the prime time for me to write. But I don't do that every day.
Do you find that your mind is clearer that time of morning? You have no pollution and all that?
Yeah, I think my mom passed away 2 years ago, and I miss her. But my mom used to be my motivation because my mom would call me at 6, so I would get up at 3, and I'd be like, "Oh, what time is it? She's gonna start calling in a minute." And of course, now I'd give anything if she could call me. But she was part of the motivation. But my whole life was, papers didn't have to be graded at 3 a.m. Dishes didn't have to be washed if they hadn't been washed the night before. My neighbor wasn't up doing whatever he does. I don't know what he does over there, but making all that noise. No one in my household was demanding my attention. And so there's a certain freedom that comes at that time. And I've just always been that kind of writer that has to spend it first, because I get really frustrated on days that I feel like I could write and I really want to write, but if I haven't written by 6, then I start to get panicky, like, okay, it's not going to happen today, because I know that through the rest of the day, past 6 a.m., other demands come into the day. Yes, life starts happening. Like the other morning, I decided was coming off the flu, and so I extended it a little bit. I mean, I still wasn't feeling good, but I thought, I have an excuse to be home, a real bona fide one. I almost ended up in the hospital, so this is great. It wasn't great, but I was thinking, I can still stay home. And of course, I piddled around, and I said, well, so I'm going to start a load of laundry while I'm doing it, and I had all my stuff laid out. And then the gas company decides that this is the day that they need to bring a big witch ditch out and replace all the lines in the neighborhood, starting in front of my house. So they're out there, and I went out there and I said, what are y'all doing? And he said, ma'am, you should have gotten a letter. And I said, I did not get a letter. And he said, well, we'll be out here for about 3 weeks. And digging up the sidewalk, digging up the yard. So I just said, okay, I'm going back to bed.
Do you feel that you have to get uncomfortable to be comfortable
What do you mean?
as far as writing?
Maybe. And maybe it's an excuse, but I have to do a lot. Especially with writing a novel. It's not the same as when I'm writing short stories. I can write a short story, or I can write a poem, and there's something wonderful about it, about having it all in one pile. Like I can hold a short story. Usually my short stories are no longer than 25 pages or so. So I can hold the whole thing. I can actually carry it around with me. I can hold it in my head. Novel's a whole different, and I'm writing a memoir now. It's a whole different ball game of trying to figure out, of being able to dive back into it. Where was I? What was my train of thought when I was dealing with this? So it's a whole different thing. And I'm not sure what you mean by uncomfortable, but I'm often uncomfortable. Like if I don't write, if I go for a long time without writing, one, everybody around me is miserable, but I also feel it physically. Like I can physically feel sick, like my shoulders get tight. I just feel like I've got to do this before I implode. Like I've got to get some stuff down.
I was going to ask you if you were working on another novel, but you just said you're working on a memoir.
I'm working on a memoir, which I also started a big fight with my agent and everybody about the memoir because I basically started writing my mother's, like a biography basically about my mother. I took one of the one of the hospitals that my mother spent the most time in was called Eastern State Hospital, which is in Lexington. And so they were getting ready to turn it into a community college a few years ago. And so they were given sort of what was billed as the last tours of the original buildings. And so a good friend of mine, Nikki Finney, who's a poet, said, you should really take this tour. And I said, you're talking about something that hurts. I'm like, that's a Pandora's box. I don't want to open that. And she's like, well, I think that would be a good idea for you. And I said, okay, thanks. Love you. Bye. And so then she called back and she's like, well, you know that the tour is on such and such a date. I said, okay, great. See you later. And she said, call me again. So I'm going to pick you up on Sunday at such and such time. I said, well, Nikki, I think. She's like, see you later. So she takes me on the tour, and I decided that I couldn't handle it emotionally. So my approach was to be very clinical. So I had my journal, and I was taking notes, and they were giving out sheets about, talking in general about where people were and talking a little bit about the African-American history of Eastern State and taking a tour, and I'm just writing things down and taking notes. And then at the end of the tour, they asked me, I told them that my mother had spent a lot of time there. And they said, well, you can get your mother's records. And I said, oh. And she said, usually it's a small file. It's usually pretty clinical. I don't know if it would be helpful to you or not, but she said, if you can get your mother to sign, then you won't have to go. You usually have to go through a lawyer, but if you can get your mother to sign permission, you won't have to go through a lawyer. So I got my mother to sign, and she did. My mother was very excited about the possibilities of this book because she was ready to pick out the clothes. She was ready to go on book tour. She wanted to know which one of her pictures I was using on the cover of it. But when they sent me her records, there were over 300 pages. So, she had been there so long. I don't think when I asked them that they realized that she had been there so long. So I found lots of family secrets, things that I didn't know. Like I didn't realize that my mother had been institutionalized before I was born. I always thought it was sort of a postpartum thing that happened right after I was born. There were letters in there from my grandmother to the institution There was interviews with both my grandparents when they would bring her to the institution to her intake interviews, their intake interviews, and I'd never, something they didn't talk about, so I'd never knew their views about what was going on with her. So 300 pages of documents that I could just keep poring over. But I found that all so fascinating, that what I was writing was not a memoir at all. It's sort of a biography of my mother's life. And my agent said, "This is not a memoir. When are you going to have the reflective voice? Where are you at?" And I said, "I'm not born yet. Like, we've got to get this." And so we've been fighting about that. That's the latest fight. Like, I'm not born. I can't.
I'm not sure if it's a memoir or a biography.
Since my mother has passed, that's the other thing about this, is that since my mother has passed away, I find that my filter through this is now more, it's not just her story now. In her absence, it's also my story now. So now I do have more of a reflective voice that I'm filtering through it. So maybe it's definitely going to be a nonfiction book of some kind. Whether it'll be a true memoir or not, I'm not sure. Yeah, it's probably going to be something else that they can't put in a box and be really upset with me about it.
A new form of writing.
So does that mean that you're actually submitting what you've written so far to the agent? I mean, as you're going?
She keeps asking for things, and then I don't know why I keep giving them to her. But I have had some little pieces of the memoir published. Like, there's been in a couple of anthologies, been in some literary journals, some pieces of it. No, my first agent was Marie Brown. She's like one of the preeminent African American agents who started in the 60s, and she's had been in ill health and had gotten her sort of stable of writers down to a smaller group, so I'm not with her anymore. My current agent is Aaron Cox, and is a different agent. My third agent, and I like her. My second agent I didn't like so much. He would just kind of talk over me all the time. So he is no longer with me. I'm no longer with him. So any last questions? I think we have about a minute. Yeah. I think just being a writer. My husband's a writer too, a poet and a visual artist, and he used to work part-time for a bookstore, and I always had a dream of being a librarian. It was my very first job, was working on the bookmobile in high school. So we both liked being surrounded by books, and we decided to just bite the bullet and try to get into this business. It's not like selling hot dogs. It's a very tough business. But we enjoy it, and we like being a communal space for people.
It's a great bookstore if you're ever in Lexington. You gotta go.
It's on Limestone Street, 726 North Limestone. All right. Well, thank you all so very much.